In the early morning hours of February 24th, 2022, at a military base called Camp Adagi in the small country of Latvia, Canadian soldiers were ripped from their sleep. Phones buzzed and glowed in the dark. Sergeants pounded on barracks doors and shouted for everyone to get up. Within minutes, every screen on the base showed the same terrible pictures. Russian tanks were rolling across the borders of Ukraine. Missiles were slamming into buildings in Kyiv. Explosions lit up the night sky hundreds of miles to the south. Europe had not seen anything like this since the end of World War II. And these Canadian soldiers, still pulling on their boots and grabbing their gear, were stationed just 150 miles from the Russian border. This is the story of why NATO gave Canada its most dangerous job. When the military alliance needed someone to lead a force of soldiers on its most exposed and vulnerable edge, it did not pick the Americans. It did not pick the British. It did not pick the French. It picked Canada, a country most people think of when they think of hockey, maple syrup, and saying sorry. NATO placed Canadian soldiers in Latvia and told them to hold the line against a threat that could come crashing across the border with almost no warning at all. To understand why, you have to understand what makes Latvia one of the most dangerous places in all of Europe. Latvia is a small, flat country on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. It shares a border with Russia that stretches for 174 miles. It also shares a border with Belarus, a country that had become a close military partner of Russia. The land is wide open, covered with forests and fields, but almost no mountains or rivers large enough to stop an army. Tank country, military planners call it. The kind of ground where armored vehicles can move fast and cover huge distances in a single day. Russia's nearest major military base sits less than 170 miles from Riga, the capital of Latvia. Inside that base waits one of Russia's most elite fighting units, the same soldiers who would later be sent into Ukraine. But geography is only part of what makes Latvia so dangerous. About 1 in every 4 people living in Latvia speaks Russian as their first language. Russia had already shown the world what it could do with that kind of situation. In 2014, Russia used the presence of Russian speakers in Crimea as an excuse to send in soldiers, take over the region, and claim it as Russian territory. Latvian leaders watched that happen and felt a chill run down their spines. They knew their country could be next. Military experts ran war games to figure out what would happen if Russia ever attacked the Baltic states. The results were terrifying. A study by the Rand Corporation found that Russian forces could reach the outskirts of Riga and the capitals of the other Baltic nations in as little as 36 hours. Some estimates said 60 hours. Either way, it would be over before help could arrive. NATO would then face an impossible choice: accept that Russia had swallowed 3 of its members, or launch a massive and bloody fight to take them back, knowing that Russia had nuclear weapons and might use them. So in 2016, NATO made a decision that would be carried out the following year. It would send 4 groups of soldiers to the 4 most at-risk countries along its eastern border. The United Kingdom would lead in Estonia. Germany would lead in Lithuania. The United States would lead in Poland. And Canada would lead in Latvia. The Canadian-led force started with about 450 Canadian troops, mixed with soldiers from Spain, Italy, Poland, and several other nations, bringing the total to around 1,500. 1,500 soldiers facing a Russian military district with over 330,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and nuclear-capable missiles based in Kaliningrad, a Russian territory less than 200 miles to the southwest. These Canadians were not sent to Latvia to win a war. They were sent to prevent one. Their job was to serve as what military planners quietly call a tripwire. If Russia attacked Latvia, it would not just be killing Latvian soldiers. It would be killing Canadians, Spaniards, Italians, Poles, and soldiers from nearly a dozen other NATO countries. That would trigger Article 5, the rule that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all of them. The entire alliance, 30 nations strong, would be pulled into the fight. The Canadian soldiers at Camp Adagi were a living promise, a human shield made of flesh and flags. But a promise only works if the other side believes it. And as those soldiers watched the fires burning across Ukraine on that cold February morning, a question hung in the air that no one wanted to say out loud. If the Russians came east instead of south, if those tanks turned toward Latvia instead of Kiev, could 1,500 soldiers really hold long enough for the promise to matter? To understand why Canada ended up with this mission, you have to go back decades, to a time when Latvia did not even exist as a free country. In 1940, the Soviet Union swallowed Latvia whole. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had made a secret deal with Adolf Hitler to carve up Eastern Europe between them, and Latvia was one of the pieces that fell to Moscow. For the next 50 years, the Soviets controlled every part of Latvian life. They sent tens of thousands of Latvians to prison camps in Siberia. They shut down Latvian newspapers and schools, and they did something that would echo forward through history in ways no one fully understood at the time. They moved hundreds of thousands of ethnic Russians into Latvia, filling the cities and towns with people who spoke Russian, watched Russian television, and felt loyal to Moscow. It was a slow, deliberate reshaping of an entire country from the inside out. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Latvia broke free and sprinted toward the west as fast as it could. It joined NATO in 2004. It joined the European Union that same year. But the Russians, who had been moved there during the occupation, did not leave. Nearly 500,000 people still spoke Russian as their first language, still watched Russian state news channels, and in many cases still felt a connection to Moscow. Latvia was free, but it carried a piece of its occupier inside it, like a splinter that could not be removed. For years after the Cold War ended, NATO did not worry much about any of this. The alliance had been built to stop the Soviet Union, and now the Soviet Union was gone. NATO turned its attention to faraway places. Its soldiers fought in the Balkans during the 1990s. After September 11, 2001, the alliance poured its energy into Afghanistan. Russia was treated as a partner, not an enemy. There were meetings, handshakes, and agreements. NATO even signed a document in 1997 promising not to station large numbers of combat troops in the countries that had recently joined the alliance. No one built bases in the Baltic states. No one drew up serious plans to defend them. The feeling was that the political promise of Article 5 was enough. If Russia ever threatened a NATO member, surely the threat of war with the entire alliance would keep Moscow in line. Russia had other ideas. Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999, spent years rebuilding Russia's military and testing the West's limits. In 2007, a wave of cyber attacks slammed into Estonia, crashing government websites and banking systems. Western intelligence pointed at Russia. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, a small country in the Caucasus that had been trying to move closer to the West. Russian tanks rolled in, Russian jets bombed Georgian positions, and within days Moscow recognized 2 breakaway regions as independent states. The message was clear. Russia was willing to use force to keep its neighbors in line, and the West did very little to stop it. Then came 2014, and everything changed. In February of that year, protests in Ukraine toppled a president who had been friendly to Moscow. Putin responded with stunning speed. Soldiers without insignia on their uniforms appeared in Crimea, a region of Ukraine where most people spoke Russian. They seized government buildings, military bases, and airports. Within weeks, Russia held a rushed vote and announced that Crimea was now part of Russia. At the same time, Russian-backed fighters launched a war in eastern Ukraine, in regions where Russian speakers made up a large share of the population. The playbook was terrifyingly simple. Find a place with Russian speakers, claim they are being mistreated, send in soldiers, take the land, dare the world to do something about it. Latvia had the highest percentage of ethnic Russians of any NATO country. Russia had already been handing out Russian passports to people in the Baltics. Russian television was beaming into Latvian homes every day, telling Russian speakers that their government did not care about them. Everything Russia had done in Crimea, it could try to do in Latvia. The question was no longer whether Russia might threaten a NATO member. The question was what NATO planned to do about it. The answer came at a summit in Warsaw, Poland, in July 2016. NATO leaders gathered and agreed to create something called the Enhanced Forward Presence. 4 groups of multinational soldiers would be sent to the 4 countries most at risk along NATO's eastern edge. Each group needed a lead nation, a country that would provide the commander, the headquarters, and the largest share of troops. The United States took Poland, which made sense because America already had a strong military relationship there. The United Kingdom took Estonia, eager to prove it still mattered after voting to leave the European Union. Germany took Lithuania, a bold political statement given how dependent Berlin had become on Russian natural gas. And then there was Latvia, the hardest assignment of all. The most exposed position, the country with the largest Russian-speaking minority, the flattest terrain, the closest proximity to major Russian military forces. NATO needed a country that was strong enough to lead, but would not provoke Russia into overreacting. A country with real combat experience, but without the political baggage of being a nuclear superpower. A country comfortable leading soldiers from many different nations who spoke many different languages. Canada fit every requirement, and in a way that no one said out loud, it fit one more. It was important enough that killing its soldiers would drag the entire alliance into war, but not so powerful that putting it on Russia's doorstep would push Moscow into doing something desperate before the troops were even in place. Camp Adagi sits about 15 miles northeast of Riga, surrounded by thick pine forests that stretch in every direction like a dark green blanket. When the first Canadian soldiers arrived in June 2017, they found a Latvian military base that was functional but bare. The barracks were simple. The training grounds were rough. The winters brought temperatures that dropped to 25 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Spring turned the forests and fields into a sea of mud that swallowed boots and bogged down armored vehicles. And always, in the back of every soldier's mind, was the knowledge that the Russian border lay just a few hours' drive to the east. Everyone in the battle group understood the math. 1,500 soldiers were never going to stop a Russian invasion, and Moscow seemed determined to remind them of that fact. In the fall of 2017, just months after the Canadians arrived, Russia launched a massive military exercise called Zapad. Officially, Moscow said about 12,000 troops were involved. Western intelligence agencies estimated the real number was somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000. Those soldiers rehearsed offensive operations that looked exactly like an invasion of the Baltic states, including practice runs at seizing the Suwalki Gap, a narrow 65-mile corridor of land that is the only ground connection between the Baltic countries and the rest of NATO. If Russia cut that corridor, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania would be completely surrounded, reachable only by air and sea, both of which Russian missiles and warships could threaten. The challenges facing the Canadian commanders went far beyond the size of the enemy. Leading a multinational force meant dealing with soldiers who spoke different languages, used different equipment, followed different rules, and came from military cultures that sometimes clashed. A Spanish company might use radios that could not talk to Czech radios. Italian ammunition might not fit in Polish weapons. Orders had to be given in English, but not everyone spoke English fluently. And in the chaos of a simulated battle, hand signals sometimes replaced words entirely. Building trust between soldiers from 10 different countries who had never trained together took time, patience, and more joint exercises than anyone could count. Meanwhile, Russia kept pushing from the shadows. Russian aircraft flew near Baltic airspace with their tracking signals turned off, forcing NATO jets to scramble hundreds of times each year. Russian electronic warfare systems jammed GPS signals across the region, messing with civilian flights and military navigation alike. Russian state media pumped out stories calling NATO troops occupiers and invaders, trying to turn the local population against the soldiers who were there to protect them. Fake news stories appeared online claiming Canadian soldiers had committed crimes in Latvian towns. None of it was true, but the goal was never truth. The goal was doubt. Every day, the Canadian-led battle group trained for a fight they hoped would never come. They drove their armored vehicles through frozen forests. They dug fighting positions in muddy fields. They practiced defending crossroads and bridges against an enemy that outnumbered them by a factor that no training exercise could honestly replicate. And every night they went to sleep knowing that the most important thing about their mission was not whether they could win, but whether the enemy believed that attacking them would cost more than it was worth. For nearly 5 years, the Canadian-led battle group trained, watched, and waited. The mission settled into a rhythm of exercises and rotations, new faces replacing old ones every 6 months. The same frozen forests and muddy fields greeting each wave of soldiers. Some people back home started to wonder if the whole thing was just an expensive show, a political gesture that would never be tested. Then came the morning of February 24th, 2022, and everything that had felt like practice suddenly felt like preparation for something real. When Russian missiles began slamming into Ukrainian cities, and columns of Russian armor poured across Ukraine's borders, the Canadian battle group at Camp Adagi went to full alert within hours. Ammunition that had been stored was handed out. Leave was canceled for every soldier on base. Defensive positions that had been planned on maps were reviewed with fresh and urgent eyes. Officers gathered around screens watching the same footage the rest of the world was watching, but for them it carried a weight that civilians could not fully feel. Many of these Canadian soldiers had personally trained Ukrainian troops through a program called Operation Unifier, which Canada had been running since 2015. Over the course of that mission, Canadian instructors had trained more than 33,000 Ukrainian military personnel. Some of the Canadians at Adagi recognized the places being bombed. Some knew the faces of the soldiers now fighting for their lives. This was not a distant war. It was happening to people they had worked with, eaten with, and laughed with. Outside the base, the people of Latvia watched the invasion unfold with a fear that ran deeper than anything outsiders could understand. This was a nation that carried the memory of Soviet occupation in its bones. The last Russian troops had not left Latvian soil until 1994, less than 30 years earlier. Older Latvians remembered the deportations, the suppression, the decades of foreign control. Now they watched Russia do to Ukraine what it had once done to them, and the question that had always lingered in the background pushed its way to the front. Could Latvia be next? The answer from NATO came 4 months later at a summit in Madrid, Spain, in June 2022. Alliance leaders gathered and made the most dramatic shift in NATO's defense posture since the end of the Cold War. The 4 battle groups along the eastern flank, including Canada's in Latvia, would no longer be battalion-sized forces of around 1,500 troops. They would be scaled up to brigade-sized formations of 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers or more. Canada was asked to lead this expanded force, and Canada said yes. The commitment meant deploying up to 2,200 Canadian troops as the core of the brigade, making it the largest sustained Canadian military deployment overseas since the war in Afghanistan, and possibly the most significant Canadian military presence in Europe since World War II. This was no longer a symbolic tripwire. NATO was asking Canada to command a real warfighting formation on the most exposed edge of the alliance. That meant Canada needed to bring heavier equipment, more firepower, better air defenses, and the kind of logistical backbone that could sustain a brigade in combat. In April 2023, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited Latvia and announced a commitment of roughly 2.6 billion Canadian dollars over 3 years to support the mission, including new infrastructure at Camp Adagi, pre-positioned equipment, and additional troop rotations. Canada's defense minister called it the most significant military investment in a generation. But the promise came with painful realities attached. The Canadian Armed Forces were already struggling. They were short roughly 16,000 personnel against their authorized strength. Recruitment had slowed to a crawl. Key equipment was aging or had been sent to Ukraine. Canada had donated or pledged a number of its limited Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukrainian military, raising hard questions about what would be left for Latvia. Building brigade-scale facilities at Adagi would take years, not months. Critics at home and within the alliance began asking a sharp and uncomfortable question. Canada had accepted the most dangerous job in NATO. It had promised to do even more. But could it actually deliver? The gap between what Canada said it would do and what Canada could do had never been wider, and the stakes had never been higher. The reactions to Canada's expanded role in Latvia came from every direction, and they told very different stories depending on who was talking. In Riga, the capital of Latvia, the feeling was a complicated mix of deep gratitude and lingering worry. Latvians overwhelmingly supported having NATO troops on their soil. Polls taken after the invasion of Ukraine showed that more than 70% of the population wanted the alliance presence to stay and grow. Canadian flags appeared in shop windows. Latvian children drew thank you cards for the soldiers at Adagi. But beneath the warmth, there was an anxiety that no number of flags could cover up. Latvian leaders had spent years asking NATO for a permanent presence, not a rotating one. Defense Minister Artis Pabriks had said it plainly before the invasion, telling reporters that rotation is not the same as commitment. When soldiers come and go every 6 months, he argued, it sends a different message than soldiers who unpack their bags and stay. President Egils Levits put it even more bluntly after Russia attacked Ukraine, saying that what was happening there could happen in Latvia, and that his country had always known this. Ordinary Latvians felt the change in ways that went beyond politics. In towns near Camp Adagi, people who had grown used to seeing Canadian armored vehicles on the roads now saw more of them, moving faster, training harder. Families began quietly reviewing evacuation plans. The Latvian government updated its civil defense guidelines, telling citizens how to prepare emergency supplies and where to go if the worst happened. Young Latvians who had never considered military service started signing up for the Zemesardze, Latvia's National Guard. The country's defense spending, which had already been climbing, shot past NATO's target of 2% of its economy and kept rising toward 2.4% by 2024, with plans to go even higher. Latvia was not waiting for anyone to save it. It was building its own defenses around the Canadian-led force like a wall being raised brick by brick. Back in Canada, the reaction was more divided. Supporters of the mission argued that this was the most important thing Canada had done for the alliance since the Korean War. They said it proved that Canada was a serious partner, not a free rider coasting on the protection of larger allies. Military leaders spoke with pride about what their soldiers were doing, and veterans of Afghanistan recognized something familiar in the weight of the mission, even if the enemy and the terrain were completely different. But critics pushed back hard. Military analysts pointed to the same problems that had shadowed the original commitment: the personnel shortages, the aging equipment, the tanks sent to Ukraine. The gap between ambition and capability was not closing. It was growing, and everyone paying attention could see it. From Moscow, the response was predictable, but no less dangerous for being expected. Russian officials called the expanded NATO presence in the Baltics provocative and destabilizing. State media described Canadian troops as occupiers, echoing the same language Russia used about NATO in general. The disinformation campaigns that had begun the moment Canadian boots touched Latvian soil only grew louder and more aggressive. Russia also responded with military muscle. The Kaliningrad exclave, wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic coast, continued to bristle with advanced weapons. Iskander missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads sat in their launchers. S-400 air defense systems could reach deep into NATO airspace. And Russia's war in Ukraine, while consuming enormous resources, also served as a live demonstration of what Russian forces were willing to do to a neighboring country. Perhaps the most telling reactions came from the soldiers themselves, the Canadians and their multinational partners who lived the mission every day. The battle group's diversity was both its greatest strength and its most persistent challenge. The friction of language, equipment, and culture that had defined life on base from the very first day never fully disappeared. Yet something remarkable happened over the months and years of shared training, shared cold, and shared purpose. Bonds formed across every line that might have divided them. A Canadian sergeant and a Spanish corporal who could barely hold a conversation in words learned to read each other's movements in the field. A Polish lieutenant and an Italian medic discovered they shared the same dark humor about the weather. These soldiers were not natural allies in any historical or cultural sense. Many of them came from countries that had no traditional connection to the Baltics at all. But they were all standing in the same frozen forest, facing the same direction, and that shared reality built something that no diplomat could have created in a conference room. Hey, quick pause here. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like these deserve to be heard, and look where we're at now, dreaming of 100,000 subscribers. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to my channel Canadians at War, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The Canadian-led mission in Latvia was never just about one base in one small country. What happened at Camp Adaja rippled outward and reshaped how the entire NATO alliance thought about defending itself. For more than 20 years after the Cold War ended, NATO had operated on a simple idea. If Russia ever attacked a member nation, the alliance would mobilize its forces, move them east, and take back whatever had been lost. Military planners called this deterrence by punishment. The message to Moscow was straightforward. You might grab some land at first, but we will make you pay such a terrible price that it will not be worth it. The problem was that this approach accepted something that the people living in the Baltic states found completely unacceptable. It accepted that their countries might be occupied, their cities bombed, their people killed or displaced, while the rest of the alliance slowly gathered its strength to come rescue them. For Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, being liberated after weeks or months of Russian occupation was not a comfort. It was a nightmare dressed up as a strategy. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, NATO finally shifted its thinking. The new approach was called deterrence by denial. Instead of promising to punish Russia after an attack, the alliance would try to make an attack impossible to succeed in the first place. That meant putting enough forces forward, close to the border, so that Russia could never achieve the kind of quick victory the Rand war games had predicted. No more accepting that the Baltics might fall in 36 hours while reinforcements were being organized hundreds of miles away. The goal now was to stop an invasion at the border, or as close to it as possible. And the Canadian-led brigade in Latvia was at the very center of this new thinking. At the Madrid summit in 2022, NATO leaders agreed to a new force model that would put 300,000 troops at high readiness, organized in layers that could respond at increasing speed. The battle groups in the Baltic states and Poland were the tip of the spear, the first forces any attacker would have to go through. Behind them, heavier formations from larger NATO nations would be ready to move within days. And behind those, the full weight of the alliance, including American power, would follow. For the first time since the Cold War, NATO drew up detailed and classified defense plans for every inch of alliance territory, including specific operational plans for how to defend Latvia. The political and moral commitment was absolute. Not one square mile of NATO land would be given up voluntarily. There would be no plan that traded Baltic territory for time. Canada's role in this new architecture was far larger than its population or military size might suggest. As the framework nation in Latvia, Canada was now the operational commander of a multinational brigade on the most exposed part of NATO's eastern flank. Canadian officers worked directly with Latvian military and political leaders on defense planning. Canadian headquarters staff coordinated with NATO's broader command structure for the entire Baltic region. In practical terms, if war came, a Canadian general would be making life-and-death decisions in the opening hours of a conflict between nuclear-armed powers. This was a level of military responsibility that few in Ottawa had imagined Canada would carry in the 21st century. The mission also forced the Canadian military to change how it trained and thought about war. An entire generation of Canadian officers and soldiers had been shaped by Afghanistan, where the enemy was insurgents hiding among civilians, planting roadside bombs, and fighting in small groups. The skills that kept soldiers alive in Kandahar, things like building relationships with village elders, patrolling narrow streets on foot, and hunting for hidden explosives, were almost useless against the kind of threat Russia posed. A Russian attack on Latvia would come with tanks, artillery, attack helicopters, cruise missiles, electronic warfare that could blind communications, and the ever-present shadow of nuclear weapons. Canadian soldiers had to relearn how to fight a large-scale conventional war against an enemy that had air power, armor, and the ability to jam every radio and GPS signal on the battlefield. The last time Canada had faced anything like this was the Korean War in the early 1950s, more than 70 years earlier. Every other Baltic nation was undergoing its own transformation at the same time, building its defenses around the NATO framework. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all poured money into their militaries. They bought new weapons, expanded their forces, and developed creative plans for what to do if conventional defense failed. All three countries studied the history of their own partisan fighters, the Forrest brothers, who had waged guerrilla war against Soviet occupation in the 1940s and 1950s. If the worst happened and their countries were overrun, they intended to keep fighting from the forests and swamps, making occupation as painful and costly as possible. The Canadian-led brigade was the shield, but behind it, the Baltic nations were sharpening every blade they had. Behind the big numbers and grand strategy, the mission in Latvia was carried on the backs of individual human beings, each one with a story that no headline could fully capture. To understand what this mission really meant, you have to zoom in past the maps and the politics and see the people. Picture a Canadian lieutenant colonel standing in the command post at Camp Adaji late at night, long after most of the base has gone quiet. He is a veteran of Afghanistan, a man who earned his rank in the dust and heat of Kandahar province, where the enemy fought with rifles and homemade bombs buried in dirt roads. Now he commands a multinational battalion in a country he had barely heard of 10 years ago, and the potential enemy is not a group of insurgents, but the armed forces of a nuclear superpower. On his desk are intelligence reports about Russian troop movements, satellite images of military equipment being repositioned near the border, and exercise plans for the next joint training operation with soldiers from 8 different countries. He thinks about his wife back in Petawawa, Ontario, and their 2 children who are growing up seeing their father on a screen more often than in person. He thinks about the Latvian officer he works with every day, a quiet and serious man who once told him that his grandmother was deported to Siberia in 1949 and never came back. The weight of what he is responsible for sits on his chest like a stone. He is not just commanding soldiers, he is holding a piece of a promise that the entire NATO alliance has made to 2 million Latvian people. If he fails, if deterrence breaks, the consequences stretch far beyond anything one person should have to carry. In a small apartment in Riga, a woman in her 30s gets ready for another day at Camp Adaji, where she works as a cultural liaison and translator for the Canadian battle group. She is Latvian, born and raised, but her parents are ethnically Russian. She grew up speaking both languages, moving between 2 worlds that sometimes felt like 2 different countries living on top of each other. Her mother still watches Russian television every evening, and after the invasion of Ukraine, the arguments at the family dinner table became unbearable. Her mother repeated things she'd heard on Russian news about NATO being the real aggressor, about Ukraine bringing the war on itself. She tried to explain what she saw every day at the base, the Canadian soldiers who were there not to occupy, but to protect. The conversations always ended the same way, with silence and hurt feelings on both sides. She represents something that no military planner can put on a chart. The Russian-speaking minority in Latvia is not a single block of people who all think the same way. It is hundreds of thousands of individual lives, each one navigating loyalty, identity, fear, and belonging in ways that are deeply personal and impossibly complicated. At the other end of the rank structure, a 20-year-old Canadian private from a small town in Ontario serves his first overseas deployment. He joined the army because there were not many options back home, and because something about the idea of serving his country felt right in a way he could not fully explain. He trained at bases across Canada, learned to drive a Lev-armored vehicle, qualified on his rifle, and was told he was going to Latvia. He did not know where Latvia was. He looked it up on his phone during the flight over. When the invasion of Ukraine happened during his rotation, something shifted inside him that he has struggled to put into words. The exercises stopped feeling like practice. When he drove his LAV into a defensive position facing east, The tree line ahead of him suddenly looked different. Every shadow could be something. Every sound carried a question. He writes letters home to his parents that try to explain what it feels like, but the words never seem big enough. How do you tell your mother that you are fine, while also telling her that you spent the afternoon rehearsing what to do if tanks appear on the horizon? In a farmhouse near the base, an elderly Latvian man in his 80s watches the Canadian soldiers from his window as their vehicles rumble past on the road. He grew up hearing the stories of 1940, when foreign soldiers came to Latvia and did not leave for 50 years. He remembers the long gray decades that followed, the fear, the deportations, the occupation when speaking your own language too loudly could get you reported. But these soldiers are different, and he knows it in his bones. These soldiers are here because Latvia asked them to come. On open days at the base, he puts on his best coat and walks through the gates to shake hands with the young Canadians, who are the same age his grandsons were when they left for London and Toronto looking for better lives. Through a translator, he tells every officer he meets the same thing. You must stay. The Russians will test you. They always test. Latvia has survived before and will survive again, but not alone, never alone. And thousands of miles away in Canada, a military spouse sits at a kitchen table in base housing after putting 2 small children to bed. Her phone is on the table, screen up, waiting for a message that might come at any hour because of the time difference. The anxiety of this deployment is different from what other military spouses described about Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the fear was constant and specific: a roadside bomb, a firefight, a rocket attack on the base. In Latvia, the fear is quieter, but in some ways bigger. It is the fear that one morning she will turn on the news and see that the world has changed completely, that the border her husband is guarding has been crossed, and that the war everyone said would never happen has begun. She does not talk about this with her civilian friends because they would not understand. She talks about it with the other spouses on the base, women and men who carry the same weight, who check the same news feeds, who understand that loving someone in uniform means living with a question that never fully goes away. As of 2025, the Canadian-led mission in Latvia continues. More than 15 rotations of Canadian battle groups have cycled through Camp Adaji since that first deployment in June 2017. Thousands of Canadian soldiers have walked through its gates, trained in its forests, shivered through its winters, and returned home carrying memories of a mission unlike anything the Canadian military had done in decades. The base itself is changing. Construction crews are building new barracks, vehicle storage buildings, training facilities, and headquarters designed to support a full brigade. The sound of hammers and heavy machinery mixes with the rumble of armored vehicles heading out for exercises. Billions of dollars have been committed by Canada and Latvia together to turn Adaji into a facility that can house and support a fighting force large enough to make any attacker think twice. The small and Spartan base that greeted the first Canadians in 2017 is becoming something much larger, much more permanent, and much harder to ignore. The mission has changed Canada in ways that go beyond military planning. For decades, Canada's defense spending had drifted well below what it had promised NATO it would spend. American presidents from both parties had called Canada out publicly, sometimes gently and sometimes not, for not pulling its weight. The Latvia mission forced a national conversation that could no longer be avoided. If Canada was going to lead a brigade on the most dangerous edge of the Western Alliance, it could not do so with aging equipment, shrinking ranks, and budgets that did not match the size of the commitment. A new defense policy released in 2024, titled Our North Strong and Free, pointed Canada's military toward great power competition and conventional deterrence for the first time in a generation. Defense spending began to climb, though it still had not reached NATO's target of 2% of the national economy. The recruiting crisis remained unsolved, but the conversation around it had changed from a quiet, bureaucratic problem into a matter of national urgency. For Latvia, the Canadian presence became something more than a military arrangement. It became a relationship woven into the fabric of national life. Latvian and Canadian soldiers trained side by side so often that they developed the kind of trust that usually takes a shared war to build. Latvian defense planning grew around the Canadian-led brigade the way a city grows around a river, shaping everything to fit the reality of what was there. The bond between the two countries, which had been almost invisible before 2017, became one of Latvia's most important partnerships. Latvian officials visited Ottawa. Canadian officials visited Riga. School children exchanged letters. Veterans groups connected across the Atlantic. A relationship that began as a strategic assignment became something that felt, to the people on both sides, genuinely personal. For NATO as a whole, the Canadian experience in Latvia proved something that many had doubted. It proved that a middle power, a country without the largest army or the biggest budget, could lead a complex, multinational force on the alliance's most exposed frontier and do it well. It proved that deterrence requires more than words on paper. It requires boots on the ground, fuel in the tanks, and soldiers who wake up every morning in the place they have promised to defend. And it proved that the strength of the alliance lies not in any single powerful nation, but in the fact that an attack on one member means fighting soldiers from a dozen countries at once, each one representing a flag and a people who have chosen to stand together. The story of Canada and Latvia is not a story of battle. No shots have been fired across the border. No territory has been fought over. No medals have been awarded for valor under enemy fire. By the traditional standards of military history, the kind measured in victories and defeats, nothing has happened. And that is exactly the point. Every cold morning spent in the Latvian forest, every exercise rehearsing a fight that never comes, every month spent away from family, every night spent sleeping 150 miles from a country that has shown it is willing to invade its neighbors, all of it adds up to the most important thing a soldier can achieve. Not winning a war, but preventing one. The success of this mission is invisible. It is measured in the things that did not happen, the borders that were not crossed, the cities that were not bombed, the lives that were not lost. A Canadian soldier who served at Adaji once tried to explain it simply. People back home ask me what I did in Latvia, he said, and I tell them I trained, and I waited, and I watched. They do not understand why that matters, but the Latvians understand. They look at us, and they see a promise, and as long as we are here, that promise is kept. Above camp, Adaji, the Canadian flag flies alongside the Latvian flag, both of them snapping in the cold Baltic wind, the pine forests stretching east toward a border that has been fought over for centuries, and that today, because of the soldiers beneath those flags, holds in peace.